Hey, this topic is going to be about the ceiling of team potential. And this is something I've been thinking about since watching a bunch of team games in esports, specifically CSGO, Dota 2, but sometimes Overwatch, sometimes League of Legends. And as I've been watching it, I've come to this understanding that there is a ceiling in which a majority of 5 to 6 man rosters cannot surpass at a certain point. Of course, in Overwatch, it's a bit more confused because not only is it a new game, but they've already done something that no other esports has done successfully. And I'll get back to that later on. But for the most part, when we think about teams, there's so many different factors you have to account for as to why there's usually a hard limit as to how far you can go in terms of team potential. And what I mean by team potential is just in terms of, for instance, there was this narrative in the last like 1 to 2 years in Dota 2 and sometimes in CS:GO about this 5 man roster should have stuck together because if they had they would have become better for it. And I actually don't think that's the case the majority of the time. I think the hard limit is generally 6 months to a year. After that period of time, you've basically seen the highest potential of like 99% of the teams. And I'll note some exceptions later on and maybe why they were able to do it. And the rest of the teams, they actually, when they hit that ceiling, it's always a hard decline after that, or a very slow decline, and they don't ever go back up, basically. And there's a few reasons for that. First, of course, is the individual skill of the team is maxed as can only be as maxed out as, how do I explain this? Okay, so when you split up a team into 5 different parts, let's just go with the 5 man roster for now. There's the usual way to do it is 2 star players, 1 3rd star that's inconsistent, but he can push you over the line, and then 2 supportive end players. And one of those supportive end players is usually the in-game leader, right? And when you put them all that way, I use like the Dota 2 model of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in terms of resources. And because you give each of these players these specific resources, they have to function to a certain degree or certain level. So, for instance, like the superstar player has to be amazing, and the second player has to be pretty good, etc., right? But because you have 5 factors going in, it's very unlikely you'll ever get a time where all 5 players are playing at the heights of their skill. Like a good example was actually the current Na'Vi. So yeah, superstar Simple is a fucking god, right? But if we look at the career of Na'Vi when Simple was in the lineup, basically all of their form peaks were misaligned. Flamey was really good at the beginning of 2017, and then he dropped off. Guardian was inconsistent the entire time. That was like internal issues, so we can ignore that. Edward was actually pretty good, to be honest, for up until Zeus joined, and then when Zeus joined, he dropped off like a rock. Right? Zeus got even worse, even though he was actually decent in Gambit. Seized completely fell off, even though he was really good for like 2 years, and that's probably because of the in-game leader issues. It seems the most likely culprit anyway. And same thing with Electronic. Electronic was a star in Flipside, but then when he comes into Na'Vi, he's like an average player with every once in a while he'll show a game, but very unlikely. He's actually more likely to show a bad game than he is a good game at this point. And so when you look at it that way, you can kind of see what I'm getting at is it's very hard to align all peak forms of all 5 players at the same time. And so a more general way to think about it is what is the average level of each of the players, because you cannot expect all 5 players to both all of them reach their peak and stay there. So it's very rare for that to happen. And so that's one of the issues as to why there's a time limit on that. Not a time limit, but a hard limit on that, just because it's not always going to be the case that you're going to have all the players playing at their highest levels, or even playing at their highest levels per their role in the game, right? And then there's another issue of the age issue, and what I mean by that is like I said, I talked about 2 stars, or 2 stars, a third star, and 2 supportive ends. But another common mix is generally like 2 to 3 veteran players and 2 young talents, and or 2 young prospects. And this is a mix between the veteran savvy and experience and maybe the star power of the old players, and then you're raising up these new players. And there's also a hard limit to this, just because the veteran players are not going to get better, and the young potential players, it's a gamble basically. There's no guarantee they'll get better, and maybe they will, maybe they won't, but there's at least a higher chance they'll get better just because they're younger in age, and that's a higher correlation. And then we have the two bigger question marks, basically cultural understanding and teamwork. And this is very specific to CSGO more so than League of Legends, because League of Legends is much more likely to mix up nationalities, mix up Koreans and foreigners and stuff like this. And when you talk about this sort of detail, basically, when I talk about cultural understanding, the best example I always use is the Swedish CS scene, specifically the Fnatic roster that's considered the greatest of all time in from 2014 to 2015, the one led by Pronax. It also had Olaf Meister, Crims, Flusha, JW. And this was a lineup where if you looked at their comms, apparently they didn't talk because they actually understood each other on a fundamental level. And so they didn't need to communicate, but they had better communications than anybody else. And the reason they have better communications than anybody else is because they have this cultural understanding. And I don't mean like just living in the same area, but they all grew up in the same system of CS. So when a situation happens, they all have this similar idea of how to go about things. And so because there's this mixed team, because in a majority of League of Legends teams, definitely Dota 2 teams, and some of the CSGO teams, there's always going to be a hard limit on that. Like you can work at it for a long period of time, but it's not like you can go back in time and then teach all of them. Like for instance, in FaZe, Kerrigan can't go back in time and then have Rain, Olaf Meister, Nico, and Guardian learn the Danish style of CS. That's not feasible. It's not possible because they've all already ingrained their own styles of CS and their schools of thought and how to react and how to play out every situation. And so that's actually why I rate Kerrigan so highly as a leader, because he was able to get it all together. Though on the other hand, like there's a question of whether or not it's underwhelming considering the pure talent on the roster. But that's a different question for another day, right? And so I've talked about the individual work, the age, the time, cultural understanding, right, and teamwork. Teamwork is pretty similar to cultural understanding, but it's basically how far you can get a team to go. And it's similar in the sense that it really depends on the players, because there's always going to be, how do I explain this? Basically, when you're talking about pros in esports specifically, there is a certain stubbornness, and this stubbornness is actually what made them so good in the first place. But there's a certain stubbornness to and its adherence to their strengths, to their style, to the way they want to play, the way they like to play. And it's very hard to break them out of that if you need to. And so when you create this 5-man roster, basically what happens is like everything's going well, but eventually something's going to have to change. And you have to really try hard to change it, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. Sometimes a player will just keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and you realize I have to kick this player. Basically, this is what happened with Fnatic and Ohio. Even though they made it to the finals of the Summit, they realized, Ohio, you've been making the same mistakes over and over again. Not only that, we gave you like multiple warnings, apparently, according to Eternal Envy, and so they had to kick him because, well, they didn't have to kick him, but they had a better upgrade at Universe, so they went with Universe instead of Ohio, and that's how that entire thing goes down. And so that's the limit of the teamwork, and this also kind of explains the honeymoon period where the rest of the world doesn't really understand how your team works yet, because you don't understand how your team works yet. But your natural synergy, maybe the way you sync up, maybe your individual skill, it kind of surprises and blindsides people. So you're able to do very well in the beginning, but as things go on, it gets worse and worse because you have to work on your teamwork. People are figuring you out, so you have to catch up in that sense. And finally, the most important aspect is something the Overwatch teams call team color. And this is the idea of having a strong identity for a team. So, what's a good example? Like, all right, New York Excelsior is a great example because I think they have the strongest team color in Overwatch. Basically, this is a team that really tries to enhance their star players, specifically Jonak, because he's able to dish out way more DPS because he's mechanically the best Zenyatta, right? And so in stage one, they basically just had Mercy damage boost him, and then he would just kill a bunch of shit. And that was how New York Excelsior played. And you know what? In terms of teamwork, they were probably lesser than a bunch of teams, but their team color, their individual skill, that's what put them to the top, basically. And so the reason I think this is like a team limit is because with a specific 5-man roster, you're usually only going to be one type of team color, and so you're not going to have a lot to work with, or you can't really change it after a while unless you take out a piece and put in a new piece. And now I will talk about a little bit about Overwatch. Basically, Overwatch may be an exception to this rule just because they have a huge subsystem, and it's very and they actually have like 4 play modes, a billion maps, and so it's very common and it's actually better for them in their case to make just like a core of like 4 players and then swap in and swap out the last 2 players depending on what map or what mode they're playing. And so that it makes a lot more sense for them. And so I don't actually know if these rules apply to them just because this is specifically about 5 to 6 man roster. 5-man roster, basically. And as for the exceptions to the rule, I will point out a few. Wings, obvious one from Dota 2. A team that stuck together way past the 1-year limit, even though they were bad, was able to get their color, which was kind of like this insane anything goes. We can play it all, like incredible teamwork, and they all peaked individually for a little bit of time. But then as the individual peaks fell off, as the meta shifted, they basically died out. And then you basically have the breakup of Wings. It was a miraculous run, what they did to win that TI, but it wasn't. The jury is actually still out as to whether or not any of them were good, except for Faith Beyond, as far as I can tell. And it's hard to even know that just because of the entire A situation, right? So that's one example. Another example might be Newbie. They've been around for a long period of time, and I actually thought they hit their ceiling a long time ago, but their victory at ESL Genting hints towards them maybe breaking through. But you know what? They've also like been surpassed by Vici as the best Chinese team in the region, both in terms of DPC and in terms of just overall ranking, I think. So jury's still out on them. And of course, the most notorious example of all examples, the one everybody brings up no matter the game, is Virtus Pro from CSGO. And even though they recently kicked out Taz, bringing in Mishu, this was a team that had stuck together for basically 4 years and was an incredible lineup, basically. And the reason they were able to do it was because they kept shifting roles when things went sour. They kept changing where people were playing. They kept changing the in-game leader. They kept changing their style. And this is the only team that has been able to do that. And it's actually miraculous that they've been able to do it. But even then, you have to sometimes wonder, what if they had made the roster change earlier? Would the team have been more successful if they had? We don't know. Hard to say. But at times it really did feel like that, because at times the individuals were lacking, or at times they really needed a new like player to really shift things up. But that's basically the legacy of this like legendary team that lived out throughout almost the entire like first 4 years of CSGO as one of the best teams. So that's it for the ceilings of team potential, and I'll see you guys later.